SpaceX is undoubtedly one of the biggest and most recognizable names in spaceflight, and today we're going to finally devote an episode to this incredible company.
And to help us do this, we're joined by author and journalist Brad Bergan, who is just about to release a new book called SpaceX, Elon Musk and the Final Frontier.
What are your views on SpaceX? Let us know via our social media pages at Space and Things Podcast on Threads, Instagram, and Facebook, via the contact form on our website, or by leaving a review on your podcast platform.
And please consider joining us on patreon.com/Space and Things. But right now, it's time for episode 196 of the Space and Things podcast.
Oh my God! Unbelievable, but is it right to gun?
You're listening to the Space and Things podcast with Emily Carney and Dave Giles.
I'm Emily Carney.
And I'm Dave Giles, and welcome to episode 196 of our podcast. I'm on tour this week, so this is a pre-recorded episode. There will be no What Caught Our Eye in Spaceflight this week section, but that will be back in a few weeks' time. We still have an incredible interview lined up for you, though.
Yes, we do. Last week, we talked to Brad Bergan about his new book, SpaceX, Elon Musk and the Final Frontier. Brad Bergan is a former executive editor at Immutable Holdings and a former senior editor at Interesting Engineering and Futurism, specializing in space, finance, and crypto. His words have appeared in or on Vice, 3AM Magazine, the World Economic Forum, the National Books Critics Circle, and elsewhere, with investigative journalism cited in Bloomberg, Discover, and NBC News, and several appearances on national radio. He holds degrees in philosophy and English from the University of Iowa and studied graduate-level creative writing at the New School. So now you've got a bit of his background, so let's get down to business with Brad Bergan.
Where cracking on is a celebrated event. This is Space and Things.
Brad, welcome to our podcast. Thank you for joining us. First things first, what inspired your interest in spaceflight and more recently, the workings of SpaceX?
Emily, it's nice to meet. What inspired me to get into space and SpaceX? Space in general goes back to being a kid. I think I skipped my 6th or 7th birthday party because Shoemaker Levy 9 had a date with Jupiter. So I kind of ditched all of my friends who were at the roller rink or something like that. Took my Celestron short scope out and naively thought I could see something. Of course, you can't with a Celestron see it, but that was an exciting time. So some stargazing, of course, a bunch of sci-fi growing up, the usual franchises that people in the West always love. And then as I grew up, I became more interested in writing in general. And I had a really strong background in being kind of nerdily obsessed with space and space travel and the wider cosmos, exoplanets, astrophysics, colonizing other planets, etc. And in my mid-20s, I moved to New York, started writing for a while, and eventually became editor at Futurism, which was my first science-oriented job. And from then, I also published at Vice. I was published at the World Economic Forum, NBC News. Bloomberg has cited my reports. And then after that, Interesting Engineering, probably my longest tenure covering space. I covered, I don't know, I'm not even sure, maybe hundreds of SpaceX launches every week. They're very frequent, I'm sure you know. And from there, Quarto Publishing, Dennis Perigno over there reached out to me and said, hey, would you like to write a book about the space race, the second space race? And I said, sure. So I threw it together. They came out in October 2022. And then after that book, I guess for a quick elevator pitch on it was, if you're familiar with the concept of the robber barons of the 19th century in the US, who kind of dominated emerging industries and helped revolutionize in terms of modern technology, the US, so that it could become a superpower in the next century. It's kind of a similar pitch that we have the space barons. There's kind of a negative connotation, but you don't have to read that into it if you don't want to. But the point is that people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Richard Branson and a number of others that aren't quite as involved in space are dominating the key industries that will definitely reshape society as we know it for the rest of this century and maybe even the next century. That's the first book. And the new one coming out in just a couple of weeks as I speak in late May, called SpaceX, Elon Musk and the Final Frontier, zooms in on Musk, his background, his history, but then takes a much closer look at SpaceX, specifically the technology and how the rockets came to be, different kinds of rocket strategies that were used, and really unpacks like the idea of reusability, which I think is the key innovation that made cheaper, more scalable space missions possible. Although the proviso is that, of course, as you know, that becomes kind of commercialized, which makes people a little bit hesitant to relate to it, since the bottom line often comes before science and exploration. But yeah, that's these two books. That's how I came to write them.
Excellent. So when people think of SpaceX, they think of the looming figure of Elon Musk. Are there other figures discussed in the book, possibly from a historical perspective, perhaps an early commercial space flight that could have inspired Elon Musk?
There are, I think it's called the DCX, it's a NASA early version. I think that saw some test launches in the 90s. That was an early version of reusability as a concept. Never made it, I think, more than a few hundred feet off the ground, but it wasn't supposed to. We had other things in store. Also in the late 90s, there's something else that we put into orbit with a lot of other countries, the ISS. So we had other things going on. And then after 2001, a lot of priorities shifted, and eventually the shuttle was retired. I think one of the most well-established inspirations for Musk's strategy and the sort of like reason d'etre for going to Mars would be Robert Zubrin, the American aerospace engineer and author, who famously gave this like very passionate speech in Congress at the Senate, and basically pushing that we need to go to Mars now. There are clips of him just like yelling about how we have the technology. I say yelling with endearment, but saying very much that we need to go colonize Mars instead of like waiting around for something bad to happen.
I'm familiar with Zubrin. He's written a lot about Mars and habitating. Is that a word? Habitation on Mars. So I think I invented a new word today. So how do you think SpaceX went from a company with several early failures, which is something that can sink a lot of companies, to one that within a decade of that was changing the space industry?
I think there are a lot of different answers to that question. At its core is perseverance. Like, yes, Musk was able to raise money. I mean, he's the co-founder of PayPal, or what we now call PayPal, and several other companies that became large, and he sold them to make money that served as seed money for his private interest, SpaceX. He was early to the game. I can't think of any that were actually testing within a couple of years that were founded as early as SpaceX was. I think it was 2000 or 2001. Blue Origin was right around then too, but they were extremely secretive for like 10 years. It was like a black box. Yeah, in a word, I would just say perseverance. There was like innovative technology that was patented early on. I had like the Falcon, the Raptor rockets came around later, but the Merlin engines, I think, to start out in Falcon 1 out on an island somewhere. And yeah, there were plenty of failures, but I mean, Musk expresses what I think is what sounds on and has sounded on Twitter like a glib remark, but I think it really is like a direct and non-ironic core mission philosophy of his. Is just like fail and fail better, rapid, unscheduled assembly. It's planned to fail all the way down, and you keep trying. They keep blowing up, but every time something blows up, you just learn something new. Every time something doesn't work, that's also a goal. Even the most latest launch in March of Starship, which is kind of like at the forefront of everything SpaceX is doing, it didn't land. It ended up burning up after losing control in a sort of suborbital trajectory, but it was still the first to get that high and be up for that long. And they learned a lot from it. So I think perseverance and the ability to keep looking horizontally at different designs and keep the costs low.
So this book, your new book that's coming out in a few weeks, promises to examine SpaceX's threat to dominate spaceflight. It seems that in 2024 alone, SpaceX is launching a rocket every week. It's a lot. How do you think the company has transformed the space game, and how do you think it'll be further transformed?
Yeah, it seems like it's happening every minute. I think this year so far, it's been 52 rockets, 51 Falcon 9s, no Falcon Heavies, of course, and then the one Starship. As I said earlier, I think reusability of rockets is the fundamental advantage here. Look at like the space shuttle, you have the fuel tanker it's an enormous work of expensive materials. It's essentially abandoned. The boosters would be recovered, but they could only be used like a handful of times. Falcon 9 rockets are Some have been used, I think, over 100 times, and Musk believes that some can be used up to maybe 1,000 or more times. I've heard that like there might be no limit, as it's like different parts of them become replaceable really easily. So I think the ability to do that, and also one fundamental difference that he was able to lock into early on, or rather his company was early on, move on from just Elon Musk, is that SpaceX was able to land very lucrative military contracts, was able to land lucrative, on the other side, was able to help smaller startup companies basically launch like little scientific experiments or commercial services. And of course, like the entire Starlink program of putting his own internet program or his internet service up in space himself, contentious or controversial as some people might think it is a really great way to build even more like passive income that's coming once it's complete. And that's like the majority of the launches these days. Like it seems like every other day I get a bunch of emails saying like, 60 more Starlinks were released today. I'm like, didn't that just happen? Am I in deja vu? Yeah. But there's just so many going up. So being able to secure the funds, again, treating as like finances the way that engineers treat innovating on the rocket technology itself, I think was useful. He is very heavily subsidized. And despite being so heavily subsidized by the American taxpayer, it's still less than 1% of the US GDP, like all our scientific endeavors. And that's not even just SpaceX. So it's a really great deal. In this book, I state outright like what the costs were for early rockets in the first space race, and even Soviet rockets as well, which often tried to be cheaper than us. That was kind of like one of their pitching points. It's orders of magnitude cheaper. And I think that makes a lot more possible.
So we've had a question from one of our Patreon subscribers, Wizzo, and I think that's kind of relevant here. So he said, critics say the audacity of early SpaceX or efforts has now turned into hubris. Are they maybe becoming too confident in their less conventional approaches to spaceflight?
I think that's like a 2 or even 3-way street. First of all, although I doubt NASA would be aiming to get so many explosive endings because it's on like government contracts. They literally are the part of the government, so they have to answer to Congress and voters in a much more direct way. The explosions, the freedom of being a public-private aerospace company allows them to basically test however they want. That's what a public-private partnership aerospace company is that they don't just create the technology. They run the rockets. They run the missions themselves. That's why we have NASA astronauts going up on SpaceX vehicles. But the other side of like reveling in the explosions, another side of that is just how people communicate now with the advent of social media, and how like nobody is really provincial if you have internet. We're all part of a global community for better or worse. And the number one thing that trends, having worked in editorial departments for the last 10, 12 years, that I can tell you, although I always try to turn away from it because I'd like to place the science, or if I'm writing about finance, whatever it is, the substance first. What does the best on social media? It's like extremes, polarizing extremes, no matter what. And people get excited naturally by extremes like explosions. So even if he wasn't leaning into it as heavily, I think that's what most people would remember, especially like the average like sense of what's going on today. Oh, there's an explosion in Florida. There's taxpayer money in it, and I'm not happy about it. So I think partially it's because of a greater freedom that SpaceX has to test, and it's okay for them to blow up stuff because it's their material and they don't have to answer quite as directly, although they do get investigated when there's a big explosion, and NASA has to look back at its contracts sometimes. And the other side is it's not all SpaceX's fault. It's not necessarily progress, but because of social media, extremes rule the day, really harsh contrasts.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? That the idea that they revel in it is perhaps enhanced from social media.
Yeah.
Perhaps, although the cheering on their live cast perhaps has nothing to do with social media. That's just all them.
Not everyone will enjoy the optics of like a slightly overweight sort of like Southern guy in a baseball cap on a big red truck chugging Mountain Dew screaming, yeah, blow it up or something.
Hey, I love Mountain Dew. There's nothing wrong with that.
Hey, I would enjoy it too, but I think it might not be for everybody.
Mountain Dew can be delicious. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Be delicious.
I see exactly what you're saying there. I think there's a lot to be said about their approach, and the fact that it's brought extra eyes in. The explosions have brought extra eyes in, which arguably has inspired people to get involved in the first place who would otherwise not have been involved. And perhaps that's not always spoken about as one of the benefits of this testing pattern. And maybe it should be brought into it a little bit more. While we're talking about what we can learn from, or pros and cons of SpaceX, do you think there are lessons that other space startups can learn from SpaceX, even if they don't have a billionaire to help with funding, especially in the early days?
Well, SpaceX has done all of those people a favor because and as time goes on, it's going to be cheaper. He's given them like the most affordable way of getting any kind of payload you want. Say maybe humans, that would be a little bit more extreme with more barriers, but any kind of technology or science project up there. So I think to make a presence would be a mixture of, unfortunately, like the biggest splash you could make would be a mixture of what I was just talking about, something that would brand really well and like create a kind of easy reaction that a lot of people would identify with, which is kind of how social media works. But more so, that would be like the icing on the cake, but the cake itself would be trying to find a way to think outside of the box to do science experiments that no one has thought of, that kind of access, because it's something that's only been around for 7, 8 years, 10 years tops, where there's a private company that will actively let you commission it for pretty cheap to put like a few kilograms or even like 10 kilograms up into space for under $1 million. And that's kind of incredible. I'm sure you've seen that there are like students in universities and even in like 1 or 2 high schools, I think, that piggyback along with many other at the same time on Falcon 9 missions to put something into orbit. They don't always work, but even those that don't work, that like break down, are still learning from their mistakes. And I've spoken to actually a handful of startups that are involved in low Earth orbit, from everything from solar power to radiotometry to new imaging systems for the Earth, and then even just like science experiments, little like bacteria samples up here to see what happens. Keeping it cheap, trying again, and doing things that no one else has tried because it hasn't been that long. So there's plenty to do.
And in terms of research in your book, you said that you were covering these launches and being there for a lot of them. Did that give you access to certain people at SpaceX, or is a lot of the research for the book come from an outside perspective?
Oh, I don't want to say something too sobering, but I wasn't actually there at the SpaceX launches. I haven't been to a NASA launch since the 90s. I think I saw like Endeavour go up or something. I watched them live stream from right here in Brooklyn. It was also during the pandemic, most of my coverage. So I doubt I could have gone down very easily if I wanted to, right when it started up in early to mid 2020. In terms of special access, I have enough freelance experience in my past that has been pretty straightforward for me to talk to astronauts and professors and engineers. So I've spoken to probably a dozen engineers at NASA and Ivy League universities, and I've spoken to 2 or 3 astronauts directly, but I've probably been on calls with half a dozen to a dozen astronauts in my time. And it's usually just like trying to think of a really cutting the same kind of standards I mentioned before about making a splash, trying to think of a really good question that will kind of rise above maybe somebody that's working at another publication who's there. Actually, one interesting thing I heard from Scott Kelly, I think, Scott Kelly, it might not have been him, but I think it might have been him, is that a lot of the astronauts in NASA, although like they're really thrilled about SpaceX and they're very positive about where it's going and they want to, they're all for Artemis and everything, sometimes they feel a bit nostalgic about the space shuttle just because it was a much smoother ride. You just kind of coast in.
Yeah, that is interesting. All right. Wow. There's been much discussion about and you've talked about this a little earlier, about the billionaire space race as well. Do you believe Musk is intimidated by other companies' technologies, or is he secure with SpaceX's proprietary technology?
I don't think he really feels intimidated, probably ever. I think that this is speaking in terms of like a range of subject matter that's not really the book, but I'm sure he feels like anxious a lot of the time. But in terms of feeling intimidated by other people's technology, I think he would more likely be envious and then just try to figure out how to do it on his own or with his engineers. I think SpaceX is something he feels very happy about and secure with because honestly, I think the only other entity that is beginning to show the capacity to match SpaceX is China, although it's a much lower frequency and they're still far behind in terms of accomplishments. But that won't be for long. And if you look at their rockets, a lot of them look like some of Musk's, if you look closely.
Yeah, funny that. Isn't it?
Yeah. What are you going to do, though?
I didn't want to say anything. It's like when Buran dropped in the 80s and we were like, man, that looks awfully like the space shuttle. What's up with that? That looks just like ours.
No, it's coincidence.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just like convergent engineering.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yes.
that looks just like ours. So finally, how does one reconcile? This is kind of the elephant in the room question. How does one reconcile Musk's erratic public image at times? As we know, he's also the CEO of X / what Twitter was. How do we reconcile his erratic public image with his company's wins in spaceflight? You know, do you think these things are mutually exclusive?
I don't think so at all. I have a background in literature and fiction, so I'm a pretty huge proponent, although there are much more significant moral implications for somebody that's actively creating technology, redefining the world. But I'm a big proponent of the concept of death of the author. And although it's a bit of a stretch to make that reach for an engineer, billionaire, CEO, space baron, somebody really, even if I'm not saying he is at all, I kind of have mixed but somewhat positive feelings towards Musk's image versus his accomplishments, just comparing it to bureaucracies that seem to not do so well and everything that he has been doing that they were trying to do or that they're trying to do. But the accomplishments are up to our own interpretations, and they're separate from even what the engineer or in terms of depth of the author intends. So I would judge like the accomplishments of SpaceX separately, and you can still not like Musk. You can think he's the worst person that ever was born on the earth, and including like people in World War II that I won't name. You could think he's worse than that, but that still wouldn't take away from a starship putting people on Mars. It would just be a matter of, well, maybe things will change in the future in terms of that. But again, like because of social media, I think anybody making any kind of wave, no matter how small, is going to make enemies, whether they deserve those enemies or not. For the same reasons as I said before, if you make a splash, people love extremes. So how can we frame, going for a walk in the most extreme way that's going to make them look really bad and horrible and cancelable or something?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a very good answer to that question. So thanks very much for joining us, Brad. Really looking forward to reading the new book. I did enjoy the previous one, Space Race 2.0. So I'm quite happy to and excited about the new one. I hope it goes well for you. And thank you for spending some time with us to talk about SpaceX. Believe it or not, we're 196 episodes in, and we've never actually focused on SpaceX really, which is quite crazy because they are basically the main player right now, aren't they? As you just pointed out.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much, both of you, for having me on. It was a pleasure for me too. I hope that the book, when it comes out, gives you plenty of material. Its first function is like a big primer, including some of even the engineering. But all the events from SpaceX's beginning to about 2023. So yeah, I'm glad that you're going to get it.
Hey, on that note, I know
Excellent.
Emily said and finally, but on that note, when you write a book that's kind of topical as well, like it's up to recent history, is it frustrating that it almost comes out of date fairly quick? I know the early day stuff isn't out of date, but 2023 almost seems so long ago already. And in the social media world, it's a lifetime ago. Do you have to panic about that kind of thing when you're writing modern history books?
I think writing these books and knowing that they're going to be that version will be out of date rather quickly. I try not to worry about it too much. I just, near the very end of my deadline, that's maybe when I'll just be a little bit stressed out because I'm just checking everything to be as current as I can on everything. And then after that, I can't change anything. But then there are, and sales, I've done pretty well with the first book, so it might happen. But for the second book as well, when an update is merited, we'll revisit it and I'll basically rewrite sections to give it an update. And I think that makes me feel a lot more comfortable about writing something that is going to be aged since it's a physical version. But I think nowhere else, the value of physical books, not just like my words, but the images as well, of having in your hands like the story of something that's reshaping the entire next century and a half of human existence, not just space flight, goes a long way further in making your world relatable than trying to find the same thing by going through like this endless metatextual spirally adventure through hundreds or thousands of articles and Twitter takes and dramas and contracts. It's all there in one place with nice pictures for you to hold this up.
Tell me more about the pictures.
But yeah, we have everything from illustrations from like early missions to map Venus and Mars and spacewalks and ISS, photos. There's Werner von Braun profile pics, space shuttle landings, Pathfinder. I'm just listing images that I see. You get to see Musk and Peter Thiel smiling their nerdy smiles around a computer with the founding of PayPal. The old Mac computers with color backgrounds, if you remember those. His parents, meetings, Soviet space propaganda about rising up and seizing your destiny in space.
You're right. Actually, having the photos there, along with all the reference material within one place, is such a value, isn't it? It's so much easier when you're researching something just to go to a book that you know from an author you trust. That makes such a big difference in terms of how you research a thing, or how you just get clarification on something. If you're like, oh, hang on a moment, what was that event that happened early in 2002? I'm going to go to that book rather than
have
the
a nice reference.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
one more quick thing on that, if I could. I think it's kind of along the same lines of when Shatner went up in Blue Origins and Shepard above the little like thin blue veil that separates us from space. The idea that like it's a place you can go. I think the closest way you can experience that, besides actually going into space, is getting away from your computer and holding something that's part of the physical world that we're describing. SpaceX is ultimately extending our exploration of. So that's my pitch on physical book being worth the book.
I like that. That's a perfect place to end. So thank you, Brad. Thanks for joining us, and we wish you all the best.
Yes, thank you.
I thank you both again. Take care.
From Gagarin to Shatner, this is the Space and Things podcast.
Okay, I think it's embarrassing that we haven't done a whole episode on SpaceX up till now. What do you think, Emily?
Yes. Yeah, they're like the major people right now as far as launch providers is concerned. And we're just getting to it, and it's almost episode 200. So we finally got to it.
Finally,
after
absolutely.
200, we finally did it. This has been a really fascinating interview. It's nice to know that there'll be sort of a reference about SpaceX out there. I do want to mention, and I'm sure Brad mentions this in his book, but we didn't talk about her during the interview. The company's COO, Chief Operating Officer, is a woman, Gwynne Shotwell, and I just wanted to mention that because we didn't really discuss her in the interview, and like I said, I'm sure she's mentioned in the book, and of course, she has a lot to do with the day-to-day operations of SpaceX. So I just wanted to mention that. I think we devoted a lot of our time to Elon Musk because he's the front-facing part of SpaceX. When you think of SpaceX, for better or for worse, you do think of Elon Musk, you know?
Absolutely.
You do think of him.
That's a really interesting point. And to be honest, SpaceX is obviously such a big enough topic that I think that a whole episode devoted to Gwynne Shotwell is deserved. And that should be something we do over the next couple of months. In fact, I'm going to make sure that's on our list of things to do because in many ways does more than Musk does at SpaceX. So I think, and her role within the industry is also super important. So I'm glad you've mentioned that. And I think when you follow space news, you are obviously very aware of who she is and what she does. But for casual, just made up another word there.
It's a new word. No, it's okay.
But for casual space fans, they probably haven't heard that name, or not even space fans. Just the average person in the street probably does not know who that is, whereas most people probably know who Elon Musk is. And I think we need to do our bit to help address that because we haven't done it. So thank you for bringing that up. There was something he said towards the end of that interview which struck me, which was when he talked about SpaceX essentially reshaping life for the next 150 years. Like the achievements they've already done and what we know they're trying to do in the next few years essentially redefines humanity for the next 150 years. That's a huge statement. A huge statement. It's not just about spaceflight, it's about humanity. And he stressed that. It's that difference. And do I have my spaceflight fan head on as I say this? or not. I can't decide, but I can see where he's coming from in that, and I think he has a point. I think it's hard to argue against that. If Starship does what it promises to do, inevitably it will reshape humanity for the next 150 years. I don't know if that bumped you a little bit, or whether, or if you have thoughts on that.
I do have thoughts on that. Oh God, Dave's gonna murder me. Everybody's gonna murder me. The Starship has the capability to transport large amounts of, cargo and humans into the high frontier.
I do. I was just about to say, I was about to stop you and say, we're going Gerard K. O'Neill here, aren't we?
Yeah. But, that's the stuff that O'Neill talked about in the high frontier and stuff. But unfortunately, back then, I don't think people took it seriously as much. And just the technology was not up to it back then. And now it's almost 50 years later. And you see Starship, the last Starship, it went pretty far before, it came back. And that's pretty freaking amazing. I mean, I still see that footage of it and I'm like, is that, it's real, but it's just mind blowing, and it really has the capability to get people off planet, and to habitations, potentially into, to Mars, deep space. This is what humanity's been talking about for the last 60 plus years. I mean, I think I would have to talk to people maybe who have, more experience than me, who are older. But I'm sure, Mars was discussed as early as the late 50s. Like, oh yeah, we're going to go to Mars someday. Like, and it hasn't happened yet, and part of that is because we just haven't had the technology. We haven't had the kind of vehicle to take us there, We haven't had the kind of propulsion. And this has the capability to do that. Yeah, I hate this word because it's cliched and it's used a lot to describe things that aren't what they, aren't quite as amazing as people think they are, but it really will be a game changer. It will, totally. Once this is up and moving, I mean, I think it has the potential, whether you like Elon Musk or not. We know he can act a certain way on social media, but I do think Starship and the entire SpaceX fleet, it has the capability to democratize space even further. Because you see the Falcon 9, what it's done, it's sent regular people to space. It sent all sorts of people's satellites to space who thought, well, I'm never going to have a chance to build a satellite. I'm never going to have a chance to send infrastructure to space. And now it's possible for regular people to do that. And it's really opened here I go with that phrase again. It has opened the high frontier. It really has opened the high frontier to like new players and new people. It's not just NASA astronauts and that's not a diss against NASA by any stretch. It's just, for a long time, it was just government only or people who paid the government. And now it's a lot of different people. And it's just, I really do think it does have the potential to alter humanity. It really does.
Even without Starship, SpaceX has already done that. They've already reshaped what the next 150 years are going to be like, even if Starship fails, because of the success of the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy and what that does at a lower price point, and the fact it's not in the hands of a government. It certainly completely changes how everything happens. So I also really thought your question and Brad's answer about how and whether you need to separate Elon from SpaceX and whether it's possible to and whether you should and so on and so forth. That's a whole big conversation there, and I thought he answered that really well. My own thoughts are similar to what he said as well. Is I think you can separate it. The one aspect that we don't necessarily talk about, or it does get talked about, but not necessarily talked about in the same way, is modern people share their opinions to a global audience because we have social media.
Yes.
Right? So I have got no idea of the political persuasion of Chris Kraft, for example. I don't necessarily like his book or the way he treated Scott Carpenter, but I respect the guy so much for his achievements within the space industry. And I reckon there's a good chance if I were to ever have sat down and talk politics or various things with him, we would have zero in common, and I probably wouldn't like what his views are. Right? I've nothing to back that up. But I'm just using him as an example.
As an example.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's the same with with many engineers who have did amazing things. Of course, we have Werner von Braun. We can't get to the moon without Werner von Braun. And
exactly, yeah.
There's always going to be people involved in big projects who are going to have questionable views or say controversial things that not everyone agrees with. We now live in a world, as Brad said, where anyone who has the slight bit of traction has someone else trying to rip them down or find out bad things about them or paint them in a bad light.
If you're in the public eye, people will dissect your personal business. I mean, for real, they will put your personal life that should not be out there. They'll just put it out there because it's fun to them. So yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, that's how things are now, and I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's desirable, but that's how things are.
Yeah. And in an ideal world, our CEOs and billionaires don't put things on Twitter, perhaps. But actually, credit to Musk because he does say what he thinks publicly. And whether that means you agree with him or not, you at least know his opinions on it and can have your own thoughts on him, which you can't of many other people at his level. There's billionaires out there who we don't know anything about at all, and God knows what they're doing, whereas Musk is quite transparent on the whole, appears to be quite transparent, unless it's a smokescreen.
Whether you like what he says or not, I often don't like what he says, but that's okay. I'm sure he's crying hearing me talking about it, counting his billions of dollars. I'm sure he's like, God, Emily Carney didn't like something I said. And he's crying into a wad of like $1 million or something.
Your Twitter account's about to get cancelled.
Yeah. Oh, geez. Oh, no. But no, seriously, though, I don't always like everything he has to say, but damn it, he is transparent, I guess. If you have to, he's saying what he thinks. It reminds me of when President Nixon on our side of the ocean, in the early 70s, his tapes were released. There was a janky taping system in the White House, and his tapes got released. It's part of the whole Watergate scandal. I won't go into the whole story, but when the tapes were released, people were shocked because, he used very coarse language. He cussed a lot. He was not acting presidential on portions of the tape. We'll put it that way. And I'm not taking up for Nixon by any means because some of the activities he did were criminal, but I think people were shocked because they weren't used to hearing somebody in that position use that language before, like use a cuss word, or something like that. And I think that's why we're so shocked with Musk also in that same sense, is that we're not used to people at that level talking like that.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
We're so used to people being media trained and not giving anything away and politician answers and this, that, and the other, that you're not expecting someone to come out and say, actually, I think this, and it be something that isn't necessarily approved by many people. Yeah, it's in some ways refreshing. I can't do it. I can't say it. No, it's not refreshing, but it's different. It's certainly interesting.
Yeah, and I'm not saying it's right or anything like that. I'm just saying that I think it's the same thing why people were freaked out by Nixon in the 70s is because people weren't used to hearing somebody with that status talking like that.
You felt you knew Nixon because he would have gone through 2 elections or 3 elections by then, perhaps, and you would have seen a public face of him. So you would have felt you knew what he was like and how charming he was, and then you see the real person in these hidden tapes. And I guess that's what we're getting at.
That's kind of an extreme example because in a way, Musk isn't holding anything back, whereas Nixon had a public image, and then there were the tapes. I don't know if that's a good example or not. There are some differences, but
my one thought about Nixon, and I'm just going to say this quickly, is what really grinds my gears is that whenever there's a scandal, the word gate gets added on to the end.
It's a hotel. It's a hotel.
It's a hotel called Watergate where bad things happened. It wasn't because there was a problem with the water. All right, there was no scandal to do with water. Whereas like we had Partygate in the UK because there was some parties happening during the lockdowns, right? And you just think. Stop putting the word gate on the end. It doesn't make any sense.
They do that here too. They put gate on the end of any scandal. We've had a bunch of different. We had Pizzagate here.
Exactly.
I won't even go into that. I won't even go. I'm like, it's a gate. Like, that's stupid. That's not even funny. But I mean, we have this. It's a hotel. It's a hotel where there was a burglary. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I think it's interesting that we can have an episode that we've said we're devoting to SpaceX, and so much of it ends up, and even though we started this little section talking about Gwynne Shotwell, so much of it ends up being dominated by chat about Elon. And I
know.
think in
I feel
many
terrible
ways,
about that.
Well, I don't think we need to feel terrible about it. I think it's just the way that he wants it to be in many ways.
Yep.
And maybe we've fallen for it in that regard and given him the airtime to do that. But I think it's really hard to talk to one without talking about the other. But we're going to do that at another time. We definitely will do that. One thing I will say is what's interesting is I remember when I first started watching those rocket landing attempts for the Falcon 9 and thinking, they'll never do it. And then they did it. And then watching every single one of them for a couple of years. Every time I saw the notification there was a launch, I would watch it because I couldn't not watch it because it was so amazing. Yep. And now the camera angles are even better, and weirdly I don't watch as much. And because they're happening so regularly, they've made it so routine, and we hate the word routine in spaceflight.
They seem routine. They're not, but they seem routine now. Even and I hate that word too. So
but it is quite something, isn't it, to think of almost not getting bored. I don't mean it, but almost not being as a big of an event now because it happens so frequently that I don't feel like I have to watch them all. Whereas when they were happening once a month or once every 2 months, you're like, tune in. Yeah, definitely watch that. And now I just can't, I don't have the time in the week to justify tuning in and watching what is essentially the same video every time. But you've got to give them companies and all the engineers and the staff there so much credit for this huge amount of output and what they've achieved and how they're making spaceflight cheaper and how they've really blown up the industry as well. They've been a massive disruptor, and it's opened the gates for other people to come in with fresh ideas. And you can't give any more praise than that, really, can you? Like they are the top of the food chain.
Yep.
Now that's you can't deny that. In terms of launch services, they are top of the food chain, overtaking other companies that have been around for years, and that is incredibly hard to do in any industry. So the fact that they've done it in an industry as hard as spaceflight is miraculous in many ways, and a story that needs to be told. And it's good that Brad has got this book. I know there are other books about SpaceX as well, but it's good that we've got these good books by good journalists coming out about it.
Yeah, and I'm really interested to read it because, like I said, I've watched SpaceX from afar from years. I've seen a bunch of their launches, but as a historian, I'm embarrassed to admit this, I haven't delved into more modern commercial launch services as much as I should be, especially because I'm living in that time. You would think I should be digging more into it because it's current. And so I'm interested in the book from that standpoint of, okay, this is something I could educate myself more about, so I'm excited about that. And plus I'm excited about seeing all the nice photos in it too.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another book as well, which I will recommend here if you're interested just in those early days of SpaceX. It's a book called Liftoff by Eric Berger, which is similarly it documents the story, and it does it from the viewpoint of different people within the organization at that point. So you learn about a lot of the other characters at SpaceX at that time and their role and what they did. And I think that's a really interesting thing to do, to realize that actually it's not just Elon. there is a big team there and some really important people within that team in those early days that made it happen. Anyway, as always, the unedited video will be on our Patreon page, which you can find at patreon.com/space and things. And if you want to find out more about Brad and his works and his book and his current book, have a look in the show notes, which you can find in the description of this podcast on your podcast provider or by heading to spaceandthingspodcast.com.
Where things meet space. This is Space and Things.
So that's it for this week. As we said at the start, we don't have a What Caught Our Eye in Spaceflight section this week as I'm currently on tour. And I think I might take a couple of weeks off over the next few weeks as well. It's been crazy busy in my life recently and I'd like to get refocused for episode 200 and beyond. However, we've got something very special planned for the next few weeks. Make sure you are subscribed on your favorite podcast platform if you're not already. And while you're checking that, why not leave us a review? Even if you've left one before, let's get some activity on our pages in the run-up to very exciting because I know because we recorded it today, episode 200.
Thank you, as always, to our Patreon subscribers. We're always open for new people to join, so please check it out at patreon.com/spaceandthings. You get some free goodies and bonus content. Plus, you get to submit questions for our guests and be a part of the show in other ways, too. So go and check it out. We'll be back with more Space and Things next week, but until then, don't forget, in space, no one can hear you me.
Thanks for listening to the Space and Things podcast. Back next week with a whole lot more.